A homeless boy never expected that fixing a stranger's flat tire would change his life. But when a black SUV shows up the next day, everything shifts. The man inside isn't just looking to say thank you. He has answers about a past the boy doesn't remember, and a truth someone went to great lengths to bury. The deeper he digs, the clearer it becomes that his mother's death wasn't an accident, and that he was never meant to survive. Now, powerful people know he's alive, and they want him gone. He can run and stay forgotten or stand and uncover the truth, but one thing is certain. Some secrets were never meant to be found. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The city was drowning in silence, except for the occasional honk of a distant car or the rustling of newspapers that the wind carried across empty sidewalks. A boy, no older than 16, pulled his tattered hoodie tighter around himself, his fingers numb as he buried them deep into the pockets of his worn-out jeans. The biting cold gnawed at his skin, his stomach a hollow pit of hunger, but he forced his legs forward. He had survived worse nights. Turning a corner into a narrow alley, his tired eyes locked onto something unusual. A sleek black SUV sat idle, one tire completely flat. The vehicle was expensive, the kind that belonged to people who never had to wonder where their next meal would come from. But what really caught his attention was the man standing beside it, frustration evident in the way he paced. Big, broad-shouldered, wearing a fur-lined jacket and sneakers that probably cost more than everything the boy had ever owned. The guy kept checking his phone, muttering curses under his breath. The boy stopped in his tracks. He had learned the hard way that curiosity could be dangerous. Approaching strangers, especially ones with expensive cars and short tempers, wasn't always the smartest move. Yet something about this situation tugged at him. Maybe it was the way the man was alone, clearly stuck, his usual world of luxury hitting an unexpected inconvenience. The boy hesitated. Was this a trap? A setup? Maybe this guy wasn't just another rich dude with car trouble. Maybe he was dangerous. He shifted on his feet, ready to walk away. But then his gaze flickered back to the flat tire. He knew how to fix it. The knowledge wasn't something he had picked up from school. He hadn't been inside a classroom in years, but from watching, learning, surviving. Before his better judgment could stop him, he stepped forward. Need help? The man turned, eyes narrowing as he took in the boy's ragged clothes, the wary look in his eyes. You a mechanic or something? The boy scoffed, shaking his head. Something like that. Big Shaq folded his arms. Appreciate the offer, kid, but I got this. The boy glanced at the flat. Yeah? Got a spare? Big Shaq's expression faltered for a split second. He sighed, running a hand over his shaved head. In the trunk. Without waiting for an invitation, the boy walked over, his movements confident, purposeful. Big Shaq watched as he popped the trunk, grabbed the spare, and got to work. His hands, though trembling from the cold, moved fast. Efficient. You done this before? Big Shaq asked, squatting beside him. The boy shrugged. Once or twice. That was a lie. He'd done this more times than he could count. Not for himself, but for guys who promised a few bucks in exchange for quick labor. Some paid, some didn't. Either way, he learned. Big Shaq watched him closely, his skepticism shifting into something else. What's your name, kid? The boy hesitated. He had a name, of course, but it was a part of a life he barely remembered. One buried under years of struggle, of moving from one shelter to another, of nights spent trying to disappear into the shadows. He tightened the last bolt, stood up and wiped his hands on his jeans. Does it matter? Big Shaq let out a low chuckle. Guess not. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a wad of cash. Here, for your time. The boy barely glanced at the money. I don't want that. Big Shaq frowned. What do you want then? The boy thought for a moment, then glanced at the diner across the street. A burger. Big Shaq studied him for a long second before nodding. Get in. The boy hesitated once more, but this time, it wasn't out of fear. It was the first time in a long time that someone had offered something without strings attached. He climbed into the SUV, the warmth hitting him instantly. He didn't know it then, but this ride would change everything. and as the black SUV pulled away from the alley, a pair of unseen eyes watched from the shadows, unseen but not unnoticed. Because the boy wasn't the only one who had been keeping secrets. The warmth inside the SUV was a sharp contrast to the biting cold outside. The boy sat stiffly in the passenger seat, his body not used to comfort, his senses alert. He had learned early that kindness was usually a mask for something else, and favors always came with a price. But right now his stomach clenched with hunger more than suspicion, so he let himself take the ride. Big Shaq drove in silence, occasionally glancing at the kid. Something about him was different. He wasn't just another street kid begging for change or hustling for scraps. He had an edge, an instinct, something that made him more than just a kid who knew how to change a tire. And the way he handled himself, quick, sharp, unreadable, told Big Shaq there was a story behind him. Minutes later, they pulled up to a 24-hour diner, the kind where the neon lights flickered, and the smell of grease hung thick in the air. The boy hesitated before stepping out. It had been too long since he had walked into a place like this, somewhere normal. Inside, the waitress barely looked up as they slid into a booth. Big Shaq leaned back, stretching his arms. "Order whatever you want, kid." The boy scanned the menu like he was deciphering a puzzle, then settled on the simplest thing: a cheeseburger, fries, and a milkshake. Big Shaq ordered the same, watching the kid as he peeled off his hoodie, revealing a scrawny frame that had seen too many rough nights. When the food arrived, the boy wasted no time. He took a bite, chewing slowly, savoring every second. Big Shaq smirked. "You eat like you ain't had a meal in days." The boy wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Maybe I haven't." Big Shaq drummed his fingers on the table. "You on your own?" The boy nodded but didn't elaborate. "Parents?" The boy didn't answer, just took another sip of his milkshake. Big Shaq let the silence hang before trying again. "You don't belong on the streets, kid." The boy finally met his gaze, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "Some of us don't get choices." Big Shaq leaned forward. "That's so?" The boy tensed slightly, unsure if this was turning into a lecture. But Big Shaq didn't push. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick wad of cash, placing it on the table. "For the tire, and for whatever else you need." The boy didn't even look at it. "I don't want your money." Big Shaq raised a brow. "Who turns down free cash?" The boy wiped his hands on a napkin and leaned back, exhaling. "Money don't last. A full stomach does." Big Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. "You're an interesting kid." They sat in silence for a while. The boy finished his food, wiping the last of the fries off his plate. Big Shaq checked his phone, then sighed. "I gotta head out." He threw a few bills on the table and stood up. The boy followed him out into the night, shoving his hands into his pockets. "You need a place to crash?" Big Shaq asked, nodding toward his SUV. The boy smirked. "You don't got a spare room in that mansion of yours?" Big Shaq let out a laugh. "Something like that. Offers open." But the boy shook his head. "I'm good." Big Shaq studied him for a long moment before nodding. "All right, stay safe, kid." The boy turned and walked off into the darkness, disappearing down the alley. Big Shaq watched him go, a strange feeling settling in his gut. There was something about that kid, something unfinished. But he had places to be, business to handle. This wasn't his problem. Or at least, it shouldn't have been. The alley was quieter than usual. The boy pulled his hoodie over his head and settled into his usual spot between two dumpsters, where the wind didn't bite as hard. The full stomach made his limbs heavy, and exhaustion took over quickly. Maybe for once he'd get a decent night's sleep. But then, a shift in the air. The kind of feeling you get when you're being watched. His instincts flared awake. His fingers curled around the small pocket knife he kept hidden in his sleeve. His breath slowed, ears straining. A shadow moved. Not a rat. Not the wind. Someone was there. His pulse quickened. He forced himself to stay still, to listen. A few feet away, just beyond the mouth of the alley, a car engine purred softly. Not Big Shaq's SUV, something else, something darker. His grip tightened on the knife. Maybe walking away from Big Shaq had been a mistake. Maybe, without realizing it, He had just stepped into something bigger than himself. The cold had settled deep into his bones by the time the sun dipped below the skyline, casting long shadows across the alley. The boy sat with his back against the brick wall, hands tucked inside his hoodie, his breath visible in the night air. The meal from last night still lingered in his memory, a rare moment of warmth in an otherwise relentless life. But that was over now. People like him didn't get lucky twice. Then he heard it. A low hum, smooth and steady. His body stiffened before his mind even processed it. Instinct sharpened his senses, and his eyes flicked toward the street. The same black SUV rolled up to the curb, its dark-tinted windows gleaming under the dim streetlights. His stomach twisted. No way. This wasn't some random chance. People like Big Shaq didn't circle back for street kids. That was the unspoken rule. You help them once, you move on. They weren't meant to be remembered. And yet, here it was. The SUV idled, the engine's low growl filling the silence. The boy's first instinct was to run. His heartbeat picked up, his pulse hammering in his ears. He had slipped away from bad situations before. Darted into alleys, climbed fences, disappeared into crowds. He could do it now. If he moved fast enough, he could be gone before they even stepped out. But something told him this wasn't the kind of trouble you could outrun. The door opened, and a man stepped out. Not Big Shaq. This guy was different. Clean cut, sharp suit, an earpiece tucked neatly against his temple. Not a rapper, not a bodyguard. Something else. The boy tensed as the man stopped a few feet away, hands clasped in front of him like he wasn't here to cause trouble. But trouble didn't always announce itself. "You're coming with me," the man said, voice calm, controlled. The boy let out a dry laugh. Not a chance. The man didn't react, didn't even blink. Big Shaq sent me. The name hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. The boy's muscles coiled, his mind racing. It could be a lie, a setup. Something about this felt off. But then again, why would they lie about Big Shaq? If they wanted to take him, they wouldn't have asked. They would have dragged him. Still, he didn't move. The man exhaled, tilting his head slightly. "Listen, kid. You can walk away, pretend this didn't happen, go back to whatever corner you crawl into at night, but I promise you, you'll regret it." That made the boy's jaw tighten. Regret? What was there to regret? The cold? The hunger? The uncertainty of making it through another night? The man took a step closer, his voice lowering. "You got one shot at this. Whatever you think you know, it's bigger than that." The boy's hands curled into fists inside his hoodie. He hated this feeling, the sense that something just out of reach was about to change everything. The man sighed, checking his watch. Time's up. In or out. Everything inside the boy screamed at him to walk away, to disappear, to not get involved. But another voice, quieter but stronger, whispered something else. What if this was the moment everything changed? Before he could talk himself out of it, he stepped forward, climbed into the SUV and shut the door. The locks clicked into place. The man got in beside him, and without another word, the car pulled away from the curb, disappearing into the city's night. And for the first time in a long time, the boy realized he wasn't in control anymore. The SUV moved smoothly through the city, its tinted windows turning the neon lights outside into streaks of color. The boy sat stiffly in the back seat, his fingers drumming lightly against his knee. The man in the suit, still silent, still unreadable, sat beside him, focused on his phone. Up front, the driver remained a shadow, hands steady on the wheel. The boy had ridden in cars before, but never one like this. The hum of the engine was too soft, too controlled. The leather seats felt expensive, swallowing him into a comfort that didn't belong to someone like him. It made him uneasy. He wasn't built for luxury. As the car cut through the city streets, he kept track of every turn, every landmark, every possible exit route. Not that it would help much. These men weren't amateurs. After nearly 20 minutes, the buildings around them changed. Gone were the convenience stores and flickering streetlights. Instead, the streets stretched wider, the sidewalks emptier, the air quieter. The city's noise faded, replaced by an eerie stillness. Then, The SUV slowed. Up ahead, a massive iron gate loomed, flanked by stone pillars. Beyond it, a heavily secured estate sat nestled behind towering hedges. Security cameras blinked red, and uniformed guards stood at attention. The boy's stomach twisted. This wasn't a business office. This wasn't a recording studio. This was something else. The driver rolled down his window, scanning his palm over a sleek security panel. A moment later, the iron gates groaned open, revealing a long driveway lined with trees that looked too perfectly placed to be natural. The SUV eased forward, the gravel crunching beneath its tires. The boy swallowed hard. He had expected many things when he stepped into this car. But this was something bigger than he had imagined. The SUV stopped in front of a grand entrance, towering double doors made of dark wood and intricate carvings. The kind of place where money didn't just exist, it ruled. The man in the suit finally spoke. "Let's go." The boy hesitated. His instincts screamed at him. This was the kind of place where people like him didn't belong, where people like him got swallowed whole. But he had made a choice when he got into the car. He couldn't back out now, so he stepped out. Inside, luxury dripped from every corner. Polished marble floors reflected the golden glow of the chandeliers above. Abstract paintings, the kind that rich people pretended to understand, lined the walls. The scent of expensive leather and aged wood filled the air. This wasn't a house. It was a statement. The boy's eyes darted around, searching for exits, for anything out of place. But everything was too perfect. Every chair, every book on the shelf, every item in the room had been placed with intention. He had seen wealth before, but this wasn't just about money. This was power. And then, he saw him. Big Shaq. Standing near a massive oak desk, hands in his pockets, wearing a different kind of confidence than the man he had met last night. This wasn't just some rapper who got lucky. This was a man who had built something much bigger than music. "You made it," Big Shaq said, a small smirk playing on his lips. The boy crossed his arms. "Did I have a choice?" Big Shaq chuckled. "Everyone's got choices. Most just don't realize when they're making the important ones." The boy glanced around. "What is this place?" Big Shaq leaned against the desk. "A place for people who know how to survive." The boy raised an eyebrow. "Sounds like a fancy way of saying trouble." Big Shaq's smirk widened. "Depends on how you look at it." The boy didn't respond. His instincts screamed that he was in over his head. But there was something about all of this. Something about Big Shaq that made him hesitate. Shaq studied him for a moment before sliding open a drawer and pulling out a folder. He took out a photo and placed it on the desk, pushing it toward the boy. The boy frowned, stepping closer. But the second his eyes landed on the image, his breath caught. It was him, but not from the streets, not from anywhere he remembered. The picture showed him as a kid, much younger, cleaner, standing in front of a building he didn't recognize. His hair was neater, his clothes newer. His eyes, though, were the same. Sharp, suspicious, searching. His pulse hammered against his ribs. "What the hell is this?" Big Shaq's expression didn't change. "You think it was luck that you found me?" His voice was quiet, careful. "It wasn't." The boy's hands curled into fists. "Where did you get this?" Big Shaq didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled out another photo. This one wasn't just of the boy. It was of him, with someone else. Someone familiar. Someone he should have remembered. But he didn't. His mind raced, flashes of memories that didn't quite fit together surfacing in fragments. Voices. Shadows. A past that he had convinced himself didn't exist. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice sharper now. Big Shaq exhaled, watching him closely. A piece of the puzzle. The boy's heart pounded. He had spent years thinking his life had been shaped by random bad luck, that he had ended up on the streets because that's just how things went. But now, it was clear. Someone had put him there, and Big Shaq knew why. The room suddenly felt smaller. The polished floors, the expensive paintings, the golden glow of the chandeliers. They meant nothing now. Only one thing mattered. The truth. And for the first time in a long time, The boy wasn't sure if he wanted to know it. The weight of the photograph still lingered in his mind. Even as he followed Big Shaq down the grand hallway, his mind kept looping back to that image. Himself, younger, cleaner, standing next to someone he should have remembered. But he didn't. And that was the part that scared him the most. The hallway was long, lined with paintings that probably cost more than everything he had ever seen in his life combined. The air smelled of polished wood and something faintly metallic, like a storm waiting to break. The silence was unsettling. "Where are we going?" he asked finally. Big Shaq didn't stop walking. "Somewhere you can prove yourself." The boy frowned. "Prove what, exactly?" Shaq glanced over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. "That you belong here." The boy almost laughed. Belong here? In a mansion dripping with money, surrounded by men in suits who whispered when they thought he wasn't listening? This wasn't his world. It never had been. And yet, here he was. They reached a large door at the end of the hall. It slid open smoothly as if expecting them. Inside, the atmosphere shifted. The room was dark, save for a single table in the center, illuminated by a cold, white overhead light. On the far side, a man in a suit stood near the wall, arms crossed, face blank. He wasn't security. He was something else. Waiting. Watching. The boy unfolded the paper, scanning the words. It wasn't a contract. It wasn't instructions. It was a location. A place in the city he recognized but had never dared to step into. An address. A name. A time. His stomach twisted. "You want me to go there?" Shaq nodded. "Alone." The boy exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the paper. "What happens if I don't?" Shaq studied him carefully. "Then you walk out of here the same way you came in. No answers. No second chances." The boy's fingers curled around the paper. Every instinct told him to run, to walk away and pretend none of this had ever happened. But there was a problem. He wanted the truth. And the truth was buried in places where light didn't reach. He slipped the earpiece into his pocket, picked up the phone, and pushed back from the table. "When do I leave?" Shaq smiled. "Right now." The streets felt different when you knew someone was watching. The boy had spent years moving through the city unnoticed, slipping through cracks, avoiding attention. But now, as he made his way toward the location on the paper, he felt eyes on him. Maybe it was paranoia. Maybe it was real. He tightened his hoodie around himself, gripping the phone in his pocket. The earpiece sat snugly in his ear, silent for now. The address led him to a warehouse near the docks, abandoned looking. But nothing about this felt abandoned. A single dim light flickered near the entrance. No security, no cameras, no signs of life. And yet, he knew better. Taking a slow breath, he stepped forward, pushing the heavy door open. It creaked as it swung inward, revealing a cavernous space filled with nothing but shadows. The second he stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind him. His pulse spiked. "Relax, kid," a voice crackled in his ear. "Big Shaq." The boy exhaled sharply. "What is this?" Shaq's voice was calm. "A test." The warehouse remained silent. The boy scanned his surroundings. Empty shelves, crates pushed against the walls. A few broken light fixtures hanging from the ceiling. Nothing that made sense. Then, movement. A faint shuffle of footsteps too quick to pinpoint. Someone else was here. He clenched his fists. "What exactly am I being tested on?" Shaq's voice held a hint of amusement. "How fast you think, how well you listen, how much you trust your instincts." The boy's jaw tightened. "And if I fail?" A pause. Then, "Don't." Not exactly comforting. A sharp sound echoed, a metallic clink followed by a soft beep. The boy turned just in time to see a countdown appear on the far wall. 3 minutes. His stomach dropped. "What the hell is that?" Shaq's voice was still maddeningly calm. "Find out." The boy's pulse slammed against his ribs. A bomb? A trap? A distraction? His feet moved before his brain fully caught up. He darted toward the far end of the warehouse, scanning for wires, for signals, for anything that made sense. 2:30. He spotted a small device mounted on a crate, blinking in steady red flashes. Not a bomb, at least he didn't think so. It looked like a tracker, A sensor. 210. He moved carefully, reaching out. But the second his fingers brushed the device, a second countdown appeared on the opposite wall. 1:59. His heart pounded. 2 timers? This wasn't a test of survival. It was a test of choice. Which one did he stop? Which one mattered? His breathing slowed as he calculated. The second timer had started after he touched the device, which meant the first one was the real threat. Ignoring the second, he yanked the first one free. The blinking stopped. The countdown froze at 1:42. Silence. Then, a click. The warehouse door unlocked. The boy let out a slow breath, his hand still clenched. Shaq's voice returned, low and approving. "You think fast?" The boy exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "You think I was gonna let you blow me up?" Shaq chuckled. "It was never gonna blow." The boy frowned. "Then what was the point?" A pause. Then, "To see if you'd panic." The boy didn't answer. He wasn't sure if he had passed or just survived. But as he walked out of the warehouse and into the night, one thing was clear. This wasn't about fixing a tire. This wasn't about a second chance. This was about something much bigger. And he had just stepped straight into it. The night air was thick with the scent of salt and metal as the boy stepped out of the warehouse, his pulse still racing from the so-called test. The city stretched before him, but it no longer felt the same. Every shadow seemed longer, every quiet street more threatening. He had spent years thinking he was invisible, just another forgotten kid trying to survive. But now, it was clear. Someone had been watching him. Someone had been waiting for him to step into this world. And the worst part? He had walked in willingly. The black SUV idled near the curb, engine humming like a living thing. The door swung open before he even reached for it. Big Shaq sat inside, one arm draped casually over the back of the seat, his expression unreadable. The boy climbed in, the door clicking shut behind him. A long silence stretched between them as the SUV pulled away from the docks. Finally, the boy spoke, his voice sharper than before. "That wasn't a test. That was a setup." Shaq exhaled through his nose. "And yet, here you are. Unhurt, smarter, sharper." The boy clenched his fists. "You think I don't see what you're doing? You're trying to push me into something I didn't ask for." Shaq turned his head slightly, studying him. "Didn't you?" The boy opened his mouth, then closed it. He had agreed to the test. He had agreed to come here. But that didn't mean he trusted any of this. Shaq reached into his jacket and pulled out the same photo from before, the one of the boy as a kid, standing in front of a place he didn't recognize. He set it on the seat between them. The boy barely glanced at it. "I already saw it." Shaq didn't react. He pulled out a second photo. This one wasn't just of the boy, it was of his mother. The breath left his lungs in a sharp exhale. He hadn't seen her face in years, not in real life, not even in his own memory. But there she was, standing next to a car, one arm around his younger self. His voice dropped to a whisper. "Where did you get this?" Shaq's tone remained steady. "I've had it for a long time." The boy's stomach twisted. "You knew who I was this whole time." Shaq didn't deny it. The boy's fingers dug into his jeans. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because you weren't ready." The boy let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "What does that even mean?" Shaq leaned forward slightly. "You think this world just forgets people like you? People like your mother? You think you ended up on the streets by accident?" The boy's jaw tightened. Shaq's voice lowered. "You weren't lost, kid. You were hidden." The words hung between them, heavy and suffocating. The boy's pulse pounded in his ears. Hidden from what? Shaq didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled out one last thing, a small USB drive. He set it next to the photos. "You want answers?" Shaq said. "They're on here." The boy's hands twitched, but he didn't reach for it. "Why are you doing this? What do you get out of it?" Shaq's gaze darkened. "Let's just say your past isn't the only thing that's unfinished." The SUV slowed, then came to a stop. The boy glanced out the window. They weren't at the mansion. They were outside a rundown motel. Shaq's voice was quiet, but firm. Go inside. Plug in the drive. Watch. The boy hesitated. He could feel the weight of this moment pressing down on him. Once he took that drive, once he looked at whatever was on it, there would be no going back. But had there ever really been a way back? Without a word, he grabbed the USB, pushed the door open, and stepped out. Shaq didn't call after him, didn't say another word. The SUV pulled away, disappearing into the night, leaving the boy alone with the truth. The motel room smelled like damp carpet and old cigarettes. The walls were stained yellow from years of neglect. But none of that mattered. The boy sat on the edge of the bed, a cheap laptop open in front of him. The USB drive sat in his palm, cold and unassuming. He swallowed hard, then plugged it in. The screen flickered. A single folder appeared. Play me. His fingers hesitated over the trackpad. Then he clicked. The video started grainy, black and white surveillance footage. At first, he didn't recognize anything. Just an empty parking lot, a street lamp flickering. But then, a car pulled into frame. His mother's car. His throat went dry. She stepped out, glancing around like she was waiting for someone. A second car pulled in. Dark. Unmarked. A man stepped out. His face was blurred. The boy's heart pounded as he watched his mother approach the man, her posture tense. She said something. The man responded. The conversation was silent, lost to the bad audio, but it was heated. Then, the man handed her something. A folder. Thick. Heavy. She hesitated before taking it, gripping it tightly against her chest. Then, her eyes darted around like she knew she was being watched. The boy's stomach twisted. She turned back to the man, said something else, something that looked like a warning. Then she got into her car and drove away. The boy sat frozen, his pulse a wild rhythm in his ears. The footage cut to another angle, security cam footage from a different location. His mother again, this time inside a parking garage, looking over her shoulder, afraid. And then, a second figure stepped into frame. Not the man from before. Someone else. Someone he knew. Big Shaq. The boy shot up from the bed, heart slamming against his ribs. Shaq had been there? He had known her? The video continued, but the boy couldn't focus. His mind was unraveling. Shaq had acted like he was a stranger, like they had only just met, but he had been part of this from the start. The footage cut again. This time a news broadcast, a car accident. The boy's breath hitched. The wreckage of his mother's car filled the screen. Twisted metal, shattered glass. He remembered that night. He remembered thinking it was just another tragedy, just bad luck. But now he wasn't so sure. The video ended. The screen went black. The boy sat in the silence, his hands trembling. His entire life he had believed he had been left behind, forgotten. But now the truth stared him in the face. His mother hadn't just died. She had been running, and Big Shaq had known exactly why. The boy stood abruptly, shoving the laptop aside. His pulse thundered in his ears. Shaq had lied to him, and now he wanted to know why. The truth wasn't just something to uncover. It was a weapon, and he was ready to use it. The motel room felt smaller now. The air was thick, suffocating, as the weight of the truth settled on the boy's shoulders. His hands still shook from what he had just seen. The footage, the lies, the reality of his past being rewritten before his eyes. Big Shaq had known his mother, had been there in the shadows, watching, and he had never said a word. The boy's fists curled tightly at his sides. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to disappear into the city like he always had, to slip away before whatever came next could swallow him whole. But something had changed. For the first time in his life, he had a reason to stay, a reason to fight. The laptop screen had gone dark, but the image of his mother's last moments, her fear, her desperation, was burned into his mind. She had been running from something, and now that same something was coming for him. He forced himself to breathe, to think. What was his next move? The answer came faster than expected. A low, familiar hum. The sound of an engine outside. The boy's head snapped toward the window. Through the thin motel curtains, He saw headlights cutting through the darkness. A black SUV. Not Shaq's. Something colder. Darker. His pulse spiked. They had found him. The boy barely had time to react before a knock echoed through the room. Not the polite kind. The kind that came from people who didn't like waiting. His breath caught. He glanced at the door, then back at the window. Escape? Or confrontation? The knock came again, harder this time. His hand twitched toward the laptop. He needed the USB, the proof, but before he could grab it, his burner phone buzzed. One new message. From an unknown number. Don't open the door. His stomach clenched. He didn't have time to think about how or why someone was texting him. The warning was clear. He backed up slowly, his heart slamming against his ribs. Options. He needed options. But then, the lock clicked. Not from his side, from the other side. Someone had a key. The door swung open. Two men stepped inside, their movements smooth, practiced. They weren't street guys. They weren't here to negotiate. The taller one shut the door behind them, his eyes scanning the room with calm precision. The second man, built like a wall, moved toward him with quiet authority. Come with us, the taller man said, voice measured. Not a threat, a command. The boy didn't move. His mind was racing, searching for an angle, an opening. His fingers twitched, his foot shifting slightly toward the bedside table where a glass bottle sat, his only potential weapon. The taller man sighed. Don't. The boy froze. They were watching him closely. Too closely, which meant they weren't here to kill him. Not yet. You're asking nicely, the boy said, keeping his voice steady. That means you need me alive. Neither man reacted. But that was an answer in itself. The boy exhaled, trying to slow his heartbeat. If they wanted him dead, he wouldn't still be standing. That meant he had leverage. But what kind? Before he could figure it out, another set of headlights flooded the room with light. Another car, another arrival. A second later, a familiar voice cut through the tension. Let him go. The boy turned sharply. Big Shaq, stepping into the doorway, his face like stone. The two men didn't flinch, but something shifted in their stance. Not your call, the taller one said. Shaq stepped forward, his broad frame now blocking the entrance entirely. It is tonight. The room held its breath. For a long second, no one moved. Then, the second man reached into his jacket. Not for a gun, for a phone. A simple move, but a loaded one. They weren't making decisions here. They were waiting for orders. The boy's chest tightened. Who was on the other end of that line? Who really wanted him? Shaq's jaw clenched. You tell your boss he's off limits tonight. The taller man exhaled, then, after what felt like forever, gave a small nod. Without another word, the two men turned and walked out, stepping back into their SUV. The door shut. The boy finally released the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Shaq didn't turn to him. Not yet. He just watched through the window as the SUV pulled away, disappearing down the dark road. Then, finally, he turned. And for the first time since they had met, Big Shaq looked tired. You should have run, he muttered. The boy squared his shoulders. I'm done running. Shaq studied him carefully. Then slowly, he nodded. Then you need to know what you're up against. They didn't go back to the mansion. They didn't go anywhere expensive, or grand, or secure. Shaq drove them to an old parking garage, the kind that smelled like oil and rain, the kind no one paid attention to. The boy followed him up the stairs, past rows of abandoned cars, until they reached a metal door. Shaq pulled out a key and pushed it open. Inside, a small, dimly lit office. Stacks of old files, a single desk with an old-school monitor, a corkboard littered with newspaper clippings and photographs. The boy's eyes landed on a familiar face, his mother, tacked to the board in the center of everything. His throat tightened. How long have you been looking for her? Shaq didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked to the desk, grabbing a thick folder and tossing it onto the table. Your mom wasn't just running, he said quietly. She was hiding something dangerous. The boy swallowed hard. From who? Shaq met his eyes. From the people who came for you tonight. The words hit like a punch to the ribs. Shaq opened the folder. More pictures. More reports. One word kept showing up over and over again. Project Sentinel. The boy frowned. What is this? Shaq's expression darkened. The reason she died. The room went silent. The boy's pulse hammered in his ears. His entire life he had believed that his mother's death had been a random tragedy. But now it wasn't just a loss, it was a cover-up. Shaq leaned forward. You were never supposed to survive, kid, and the people who covered this up, they just found out you did. The boy clenched his fists. Then what do we do? Shaq exhaled. If you stay, we fight. If you leave, you run forever. The boy's jaw tightened. He thought about all the times he had run, all the times he had hidden, thinking he was just another lost kid. But he wasn't lost. He had been left behind. And now he was ready to be found. His voice was steady when he spoke. Then I stay. Shaq nodded once. Good. Outside, the city stretched endlessly, full of secrets waiting to be uncovered. The hunt was just beginning. Secrets were buried, lies were told. But now, the truth is coming to light. The boy's past was never an accident, and the people who tried to erase him are still watching. What happens next? Who's really pulling the strings? And how deep does the conspiracy go? Stay with us as the mystery unravels, because this is only the beginning. Follow, subscribe, and keep watching as we uncover the truth, one secret at a time. Are you ready to go deeper? Because once you know the truth, there's no turning back.